was occupied, Belgium was occupied, Holland was occupied, Poland. So there was many refugees in France. Maybe she meant Jewish foreigners. I don't know what she meant by that.
Do you remember hearing any radio broadcasts or seeing any posters or things
Nothing
like that?
like that.
Okay.
Nothing like that at all.
Excellent.
At some point, though, the Jews were supposed to surrender their radios. We were not supposed to keep our radios, and we were not supposed to keep a car. My husband had a car. He was supposed to surrender it.
Excellent. Okay, so if you want to pick back up where we left off, which was your dad had just been picked up at the
Right.
subway station and you guys were at the summer home?
So my mother, my sister, and I came back to Paris, and then in September school started again. So we were started going to school again. By 1942, when Eichmann did what they called, we didn't know it, but they called the final solution, they started arresting women and children. Somebody, a friend of ours, who had a friend who was the commissioner of police, non-Jewish, called him up and said they were going to round up the women and children. He called my mother and told us to leave. By that time it was 8 o'clock, and in Paris there was a curfew. Jewish people were not supposed to be in the street after 8 o'clock. So we lived in an apartment building because it was a city. You didn't own your home, you rented. So the janitor lady came up and told my mother we could stay in an empty apartment on the 4th floor upstairs from where we lived. So we stayed there for the night, and we could see the buses in the street where they're picking up people. The next morning, 6 o'clock, the janitor lady came up crying and told my mother, please leave, because if the Germans come and ask for you again, I'm not sure I would be able to lie. So my mother, my sister, and I, we went back to our apartment. My mother called this friend, and he told us an address where we would go, where we could meet somebody who was a courier who would cross us into unoccupied France. What I forgot to say, somewhere in between, everybody had to have ration cards because the German was sending all the food back to Germany. But the Jews, again, had to have the stamp Jew applied to their ration cards. So anyway, we took off our Jewish star, went out through a back door, took the subway, and went to this address that had been given us. When we arrived there, we saw that courier and several other Jewish people who were there. He told us how this would work out. We had to take the train, go to a station a half an hour away from the demarcation line, and there he would pick us up, take us to a farm whose fields were half in occupied France, half in unoccupied France, and at night we would cross over. So we did that. We took the train, and when we arrived there, this courier came and picked us up. But then there were too many people, so he said to my mother, look, I'll take these people over in the truck and I'll come back for you. My sister and I, being young, didn't realize. My mother told us later that she said, I bet he sold us out. When he came back to pick us up, he came in a car with a German. And he jumped around my mother's neck, kissed her, and said, cousin, you made a mistake. You should have taken the next train stop. So he drove us in the car with a German in it that was, saluting, and they brought us to that farm. Okay, the German soldier and the courier left. We went to the farm where we found other people, and at night, on our hands and knees, we crossed through the fields from unoccupied zone into occupied zone. And you could see in the distance, the Germans were patrolling with dogs. And it was very funny because when we arrived in the free zone, there were lights, there were people in the street, which on the occupied zone didn't happen at night. So he brought us to small hotel, and he went with my mother to get us some false paper. You could get all that for a fee, of course. Get us some false paper, some false ration cards. We stayed there for a while because it was summer, and it was like a motel where people would come down on the weekend to have food and to dance. And the three, my mother, my sister, and I were in the motel. Now, there was a group of French young men who didn't want to go to war. So they were also crossing over to go to Spain, to go to England, work with the resistance. But their connection was severed for a while. So they stayed there for a few days. So my mother decided at night, we took 2 or 3 of these guys, we took their socks, their underwear, we washed them, put them to dry, and gave it to them the next day. After a few days, their connection was opened again, so they were leaving. So the one fellow who must have guessed we were Jewish gave my mother a letter and said, if you ever go in trouble, go to the southern France, to Valence, and my aunt will help you because you helped me. So we stayed there for a little while longer, and then all of a sudden the courier came over to my mother and said to us that he was working with the resistance, which we didn't know, and his cover had been blown, so he was also going through Spain to go to England, work with the resistance, and he couldn't help us anymore. So my mother and my sister stayed there a little while, and then when school was going to start, we went to the southern Valence to this lady, and without letter from her nephew, my mother put us in a boarding school, and she stayed with this woman. And the cover was that my mother was being divorced, and my father wanted us to take us away, so she ran away to the southern France. Now, I don't really know how, but my mother got in touch with some friends of my parents who were in Grenoble, and they told us if we could come there, then they would help us. So eventually we went from Valence to Grenoble. Now these friends had 2 daughters and some nieces, and these children were in a Catholic boarding school. The reason being that the farms all around, their daughters in the wintertime had to go to school, so they were in that Catholic boarding school. So they took in, they had these 3 girls, and they took in my mother and my sister and myself with the permission of the parish priest who had to give his permission. Now, nobody knew we were Jewish, only the Mother Superior. So my sister and the other little girls went to school, and I helped with the dormitory and with the food and things like that.